Recently, I read a piece by a man named Richard Rohr, and it struck me as very timely, especially as we are headed into Lent together. Richard Rohr is a Franciscan friar. He's also a priest out in New Mexico, and I've long appreciated the ways that he writes and provokes great thoughts and conversations about who we are and what we believe as Christians. Richard Rohr is his name if you are interested in reading more. What he wrote was titled Incarnation Instead of Atonement. All right, so raise your hands if you've ever been taught and are familiar with the idea that Jesus died on the cross as a sacrifice to God to atone for your sins. Raise your hands if you're familiar with that. Okay, right. Very familiar, basic stuff. And this is what we mean by the word atonement. You have been atoned for, or we have been atoned for. You can start to get the sense that what Rohr was challenging in this latest writing has to do with atonement and the flip side of it. That maybe that isn't exactly where we ought to be headed with our ideas and our claims about God. And what he proposes instead is that it is the incarnation, the claim that God's own divinity took on the human flesh of Jesus. He says that incarnation is the real point of Christianity. God took our form, dwelling among us, and suffered the capital punishment of the most powerful force on earth as a demonstration of undying love for all of us and the entire creation. Richard Rohr is certainly not the first Christian to ever say these things. He points back to a long tradition of Franciscan thought, actually. But together we have been wrestling with the meaning of the cross since the very day that it happened. And for some of us, we have this overwhelming connection to the atonement of one man's sacrifice for the sins that we have committed. Others of us have struggled to connect our experiences of and our longings for God's love and grace to the idea that this same God demands violence and death in order to be satisfied for all that we have done. Some of us have suffered the abuse of father figures in our lives, spouses even, partners. And perhaps atonement is especially difficult or damaging in that light. Such are the quandaries that we have had in the fullness of the lives that we all bring throughout the years when we survey the wondrous cross. We don't all know what to make of it, given where we have been in life. I would suggest, however, that incarnation and atonement are not exclusive of one another. And what concerns me in the extreme position that Richard Rohr sets out is there seems to be a silence on this one central aspect of the cross: forgiveness. A word so central to who we are and what we are taught to be about that I wonder how a Jesus without atonement can give us a deep sense of God actually forgiving us. It is at the heart of the words that we will study on this first Sunday of Lent, actually. And throughout the next 6 weeks, we will use what are called the 7 last words of Jesus spoken on the cross. 7 sayings that are found throughout the stories of the Passion and the 4 Gospels. The Gospels, or the 4 books at the beginning of the New Testament, each one of them spends a great deal of time describing the events surrounding the death of Jesus. Relatively little on his birth, but a great deal about his death. And in itself, that suggests that we cannot minimize or look away from the cross as Christians. So the last 5 chapters of Mark's Gospel deal with the last week of Jesus' life. That's fully 1/3 of the book. In Matthew, it is the last 7 chapters. That's 1/4 of the entire story. Luke spends about 1/5 of the entire story of Jesus on that one last week. When you get to John's Gospel, something like 40% of the entire story of Jesus is set between Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday. Now, when you get to Paul's letters, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, and so forth, almost completely absent in Paul's writings are references to Jesus' life and his teachings. Have you ever noticed that? Very, very little correlation. Instead, Paul wrote, "We proclaim Christ crucified. And it is a stumbling block and foolishness for all kinds of people." I would like for you all to continue to wrestle with that tension, by the way, between incarnation and atonement. It's a conversation we've had for 2,000 years, and it will continue throughout your life. But for now, let us all turn our faces together toward Jerusalem, where the cross of Jesus waits. Luke's gospel says, 2 others also who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right hand and one on his left. And then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." So of the very men who were carrying out the execution, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." The power and the poignancy could not be any greater. They are in the act of killing him. And Jesus releases them from responsibility. On one level here, Jesus is making one of the central claims of our faith. The cross is an intersection between history and theology. Bear with me. It is a place where human time cross paths with God's time, what we call Chronos and Kairos. The soldiers who are crucifying Jesus are carrying out, in the history of the story, they are carrying out the routine orders of their empire. Silence the opposition. Make a demonstration of those who cause trouble. Hang that man on a cross on a hill where anyone entering the city might see it. And add him among the other troublemakers for this day. And so we find that Jesus is in the middle of two other criminals, and he is hanging there by his hands. This is hardly the ending that anyone who believed in him and followed him could have imagined. Peter had seen it. You are the Messiah. Others had left everything behind. He is the Son of God. But there he hung, defeated, mocked by those who found the Prince of Peace to be some kind of threat. His last possessions became the prize in some kind of grotesque game, soldiers casting lots below him. This is the history of the moment. And Jesus said, they do not know what they are doing. Because at the same time, something else was happening that is at the heart of our faith. The soldiers could not have known that. While carrying out their orders, they were also being agents of what God was doing in and through Jesus. They do not know what they are doing. They were Romans, after all. Jesus and his followers, they were all Jewish. And for them, the spilling of innocent blood had always been a part of the temple rituals where people were restored to right relationship with God and right relationship with one another. This is foreign to us. For them, it was every day. But they even had a yearly ritual where all of the sins of all of the people were transferred to one innocent goat. It was a good day for the people. It was a bad day for the goat. They do not know what they are doing. Forgive them. He's saying that what looks like one thing is actually another thing entirely. In Jesus' own death, there will be forgiveness of sins. And so this enormous intersection between history and theology is taking place at the cross. And on one very important level, this is what Jesus is saying. They do not even know what they are doing. But there's another level that is much more familiar to you and me. People are all under the influence of such complex forces in their lives, so that the sins that we commit against God and the sins that we commit against one another are likely just outcroppings of these other deeper things about us. The pains that we carry within us. The grief that we endure. the brokenness of our memories, the estrangement of our families, the powers and politics and economics in which we live and breathe. So look at these soldiers that Jesus is in the midst of forgiving while they are killing him. They have been raised to live and serve in a dictator's regime. It has an effect on them. How far away are these men from their homes and what they have had to leave behind? How long have they been drafted, conscripted to be here in this foreign land, suppressing this foreign population? It has an effect on them. Are they married? Do these men have children that they have not seen? What have they witnessed or been asked to do while serving the empire in this place? I mean, for God's sake. They are executioners for the emperor. And what we see here is that Jesus is able even now to peer more deeply into the people around him with understanding and compassion. They do not know what they are doing. We pray to God asking that our debts be forgiven, don't we? Every Sunday. And it is intertwined with our forgiving of the debts that are owed to us. And on the cross, where he is dying in pain, Jesus demonstrates more of what this must look like. To forgive another person is to still have compassion for all the ways that their own broken life has caused them to injure you. It's like that song we used to hear. We're just two lost souls swimming in a fishbowl year after year. It is the key to understanding forgiveness. It is also how the two ideas that we talked about earlier are connected: incarnation and atonement. God's forgiveness comes from the solidarity of living among us. I mean, to look at Jesus as the incarnate God is to see God saying back to us, I have seen all that you go through. I get it. And I love you and I forgive you. In the midst of the injuries that we cause to each other, the question is, can we still have the compassion to see what is required for forgiveness? Because that has been shown to us as God's own method for saving the world, right? Forgiveness is God's method for saving the world. Now, we may never be reconciled or in a relationship with those that we forgive. Our forgiveness may not even effect a change in them, which is kind of God's gamble with us, isn't it? Forgiveness is a whole other thing at times than restoring a relationship. This is important. Forgiveness has to do with our willingness to let go of anger and still desire the health and the well-being of the very people that we are no longer able to be in relationship with at times. That is forgiveness. But the cross stands as a testimony that forgiveness is God's method for saving the world. Jesus told a story once. It had to do with people who owed money to a king, remember? There's one guy, his debt was huge. There was no way that he could ever pay it. I mean, he was in a hole. And so the king rightly ordered that this man, his wife, all of their children be sold as servants to the highest bidder. The king said, take all of his possessions, put them on Craigslist, sell it, raise money to pay this debt. But the man fell down at the king's feet, begging for patience and mercy. Compassion and pity then overwhelmed the king, so that he did not just grant more time and patience as requested, but looked at him and forgave the entire debt completely, so that what he gave to the man could not even be measured. Now, do you know what that same guy went out and did just a few minutes later? It wasn't an hour that went by, he came across an old buddy who owed him basically for lunch one day last week. And the one who had just been given forgiveness for this huge amount of money had no mercy at all for the next one who owed him very little. And so he dragged him into small claims court by the collar of his jacket. He tried to extract every penny that was owed to him and then some. But you know, the king had been watching. The king was watching.